I was reviewing Q3 reporting packages when Spencer Hargrove walked through my office door. I had seen that walk before. Not from him specifically. He was only 31, and most of his working life had been spent collecting a title he hadn't earned, but I had seen it from men like him, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, the careful, deliberate pace of someone who has rehearsed this moment and wants to enjoy it. He had an empty banker's box in one hand and Karen Shields from HR behind him. My name is Serena Caldwell. At that moment, I had spent 11 years at Hargrove Capital Partners building what had become the firm's most valuable institutional portfolio. 19 active client relationships, $40 million under management, and a client retention rate that the firm's own marketing team quietly used in its pitch. Materials without ever crediting me by name. I had started as a mid-levels associate. I had grown that book from 4 accounts. I had never missed a filing deadline, never lost a client to a competitor, and never once asked for public recognition for any of it. Spencer set the box on my desk. He said the firm was restructuring senior portfolio leadership. He said it just loud enough for the 2 analysts sitting outside my glass wall to hear. That part was intentional. I could tell by the way he didn't drop his voice. He told the transition was effective immediately. Security would escort me out. I looked at him for a moment. Then I asked one question. Is this documented? He smiled. He said Karen had all the paperwork. I did not sign anything. I told Karen I would need copies of every document before I left the building, which I was legally entitled to request, and I said it the same way I would say anything else, calmly, without heat, without any visible reaction at all. Karen looked briefly uncomfortable. Spencer looked slightly annoyed that I hadn't flinched. They walked me out through the main floor, past the open workspace, past the conference rooms with their glass walls, past 11 years of daily presence reduced to a box I was carrying with both hands. I kept my eyes forward. I did not stop walking. But I did notice one thing. Near the far end of the floor, at the corner desk that had been empty for 6 weeks, sat Natalie Crane, 27 years old, 2 years at the firm, most of it in a client relations support role. I had seen her photograph on Spencer's Instagram 3 months earlier. A rooftop dinner, his arm around her shoulders. I had noted it the way you note a weather forecast. Something worth knowing. Something to keep in mind. She was already at the desk. She already had a printed portfolio summary in front of her. My portfolio summary. I kept walking. The security guard was professional and quiet. He walked me to the elevator, pressed the lobby button, and stepped back as the doors closed. I did not say anything. I looked straight ahead at my own reflection in the elevator doors until the lobby came into view. I drove to the parking garage, pulled into my space out of habit, and sat there for a while. I did not cry. I want to say that not because I think crying would have been wrong, but because I want you to understand what I was actually feeling. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger, not yet. It was something quieter, something more like clarity. I picked up my phone and opened a PDF I had kept saved in a private folder for the past 3 years, 2 pages. A contract addendum with 3 clauses, the third of which contained language that the firm's legal team had, to my knowledge, never revisited after the original filing. Had shown that document to my outside attorney 18 months earlier during a routine contract review I had scheduled on my own time, at my own expense. She had read it twice, looked up at me and said, "Serena, do they know this is still active?" I had told her no. She had asked if I wanted to flag it to the firm. I had told her no to that too. I locked my phone and set it face down on the passenger seat. Outside the parking garage, it was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Inside, I sat with the specific feeling of someone who has just watched the other side make the move she had quietly been waiting for. They should have read the whole contract. Let me tell you what Spencer thought he was taking. He thought he was reassigning a job title. He thought he was moving a name off a door and putting a different name on it. He thought the portfolio, the clients, the revenue, the relationships I had spent over a decade building would simply transfer to whoever was sitting in the chair, the same way a telephone extension transfers when IT remaps a line. That is not how any of this worked. When I joined Hargrove Capital Partners, the firm had modest assets under management and a client list that relied almost entirely on Edmund Hargrove's personal network. Edmund was a good operator. He understood markets, he understood risk, and he understood that the firm needed someone who could build institutional relationships that didn't depend on his own name to exist. That became my job, not officially at first. But over time, it became the thing I was most known for internally. The person the firm sent to pension committees, to university investment boards, to family offices that had been managing generational wealth for decades and didn't give their business to people they didn't trust completely. I built those relationships the slow way, through preparation, through accuracy, through showing up to the same quarterly meetings year after year, and knowing more about each client's mandate than anyone else in the room. I didn't win those clients with presentations. I won them with reliability. By year 8, my book was generating close to 60% of the firm's annual management fee revenue. Edmund noticed. He was that kind of operator, careful about what things were actually worth, even when he didn't always say so out loud. In year 9, he approached me with a structure he had worked out with the firm's legal and compliance team, a sub-advisory licensing framework. The idea was that the firm would manage the portfolio strategies through a formal licensing arrangement, with me designated as the licensed investment strategist of record. It was built partly as a tax-efficient revenue mechanism, but I knew, and I believe Edmund knew, that it was also a retention structure, a way of formally recognizing that certain things at the firm were tied to me specifically, not just to the Hargrove name. The master license was filed with the state regulatory authority. My name was on it, and it was embedded directly into the investment management agreements of 3 of my largest institutional clients: a municipal pension board with $18 million under management, a private university endowment with $14 million, and a family office managing $8 million. Those 3 accounts represented the $40 million Spencer had just handed to Natalie Crane. Here is what mattered most. The master license was not a job title. It was not an internal designation. It was a separate legal instrument, filed with a regulatory body, with its own rules about how it could be changed, transferred, or ended. And those rules were specific. Terminating a named license required a formal written process, a minimum notice period, regulatory notification, and, in the case of the 3 client agreements where the license was embedded, written client consent, given at least 60 days in advance. Spencer fired me on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, Natalie was in the chair. No notice had been sent to the clients. No regulatory filing had been updated. No consent had been obtained from anyone. The license was still in my name. It was still active. And as the named license holder, I still had the legal authority to authorize or revoke the firm's ability to operate under it. I had discovered this gap 18 months earlier when I asked my attorney to review my full contract package during a quiet period. She found it. We documented it. We said nothing. I was not planning a revenge strategy at that point. I want to be honest about that. I was planning protection. I was a woman who had spent 11 years making herself indispensable at a firm that was eventually going to be run by someone's son, and I wanted to understand exactly what I controlled before that day came. The distinction between protection and revenge is real. But I'll tell you this, the two are almost impossible to tell apart when the moment finally arrives. If Spencer had simply fired me and followed the proper licensing process, given the required notice, filed the regulatory paperwork, obtained client consent, there would have been nothing to do but negotiate a clean exit. He hadn't done any of that. Every management action taken under my license after the day he fired me was, technically speaking, unauthorized, and it was getting more unauthorized by the day. I want to explain the license clearly, because the whole story depends on it. When most people hear the word license in a financial context, they think of a Series 7 exam or a broker registration, something personal, something that lives in a filing cabinet and doesn't affect much unless a regulator comes knocking. This was different. What Edmund Hargrove and I created was a sub-advisory licensing structure. The simplest way to explain it is this. The firm was authorized to manage certain client portfolios specifically because I was the named strategist on the license. Not because of the firm's general registration, not because of the Hargrove name, because of my name, my credentials, and my formal designation as the licensed investment strategist of record on those 3 specific accounts. Think of it like a contractor who holds the building permit for a construction project. The company can do the work, but the permit is issued to the contractor personally. If the contractor leaves the project without properly transferring the permit, the company doesn't automatically get to keep building. There's a process, there are notifications, there are approvals that have to happen first. That was exactly the structure Edmund and I had built. The master license was filed with the state regulatory authority under my full legal name, Serena Caldwell. It was registered, documented, and confirmed in writing. I had the confirmation letter saved in 3 places. and it was embedded into the investment management agreements of 3 clients. The first was a municipal pension board, $18 million. I had been their primary contact for 9 consecutive years. I had attended every one of their quarterly investment committee meetings. I knew each committee member by name. I knew their risk tolerance, their liquidity requirements, their political sensitivities around certain asset classes, and the exact pace at which they needed information delivered to feel confident about decisions. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a file transfer. It comes from showing up over and over for 9 years. The second was a private university endowment, $14 million. The endowment's investment committee was made up of trustees who rotated on 3-year terms, which meant that continuity of the advisor relationship was especially important to them. They didn't want to re-educate a new contact every time the board changed. They had stayed with me specifically because I was the constant. The third was a family office, a single multi-generational family managing $8 million of wealth that had been accumulated over 4 decades. They were private, careful, and deeply uncomfortable with change. They had referred 2 other family connections to the firm specifically because of their trust in me personally. Together, those 3 clients represented $40 million. Each of their investment management agreements contained the same consent clause. The language was clear. Any change to the licensed strategist of record required written notice to the client at least 60 days in advance, followed by written client acknowledgement before the transition could take effect. Spencer fired me on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, 48 hours later, Natalie Crane was sitting at my desk with my client files in front of her, operating as though she had inherited everything cleanly. No 60-day notice, no written client acknowledgement, no regulatory filing updates, no consent from anyone. And here is the part that still strikes me as almost hard to believe, even now. If I chose to file a formal revocation of authorization, meaning if I formally notified the regulatory body that I was withdrawing the firm's permission to operate under my license, the firm's authority to manage those 3 accounts would be suspended immediately, pending a formal licensing review. The clients would receive direct notification from the regulatory body, not from the firm, not from Spencer, from the regulator itself, the pension board's investment committee. The people I had sat with in that conference room 9 times a year had a fiduciary obligation to respond to that kind of notification. They would be legally required to pause account activity and demand a full compliance explanation from the firm. I hadn't filed anything yet. I was still sitting with the knowledge, letting it settle, watching what Spencer would do next. But I knew the name of the pension board's chief investment officer, Harold Fenwick. He had my personal cell phone number. He had called me on it to discuss market conditions on more than one occasion. He trusted my judgment the way people trust someone who has never once been wrong in front of them when it counted. I hadn't called Harold. I wasn't ready. But I knew the call was coming. I knew exactly what I would say when it did. A former colleague still inside the firm sent me a message that Friday. She said Spencer had taken the team, including Natalie, out to a celebration dinner the night before. Nice restaurant, private room. Spencer had apparently given a short speech about new energy and new direction and the firm's exciting future. That was 2 days after he had placed Natalie in the chair. 2 days into a compliance clock that was already running. I read the message. I set my phone down. I thought about Spencer raising a glass to a position he had already structurally lost, and I felt something I can only describe as very quiet, not satisfaction yet, not quite, but close. I did not move quickly, that was a choice. Every instinct in those first few days pushed toward action, toward calling Harold, toward filing something, toward making the phone ring on Spencer's desk. But I had spent 11 years watching how power actually moves in corporate environments, and I knew that the people who act first out of emotion almost always hand the other side something useful. I was not going to do that. I gave myself 30 days. The first thing I did was find the right attorney. Not just any employment lawyer. I needed someone who understood investment management licensing specifically. Someone who had worked with regulatory filings, sub-advisory structures, and the kind of client agreement language that General Employment Counsel tends to skim past. It took me 4 days and 3 referrals to find her. Her name was Diana Reyes, and when I walked her through the structure in our first meeting, she stopped me twice to ask clarifying questions and then sat back and said, "How long have you known about this?" I told her 18 months. She nodded slowly and said, "Good." The second thing I did was build the documentation package. I pulled every relevant document I had retained personally over 11 years. My original employment contract, the addendum, the master license filing confirmation from the regulatory body, the 3 client investment management agreements with the consent clauses. I printed them, organized them chronologically, and flagged every relevant clause with a tab. Then I went further. 11 years of email correspondence. I had kept copies of everything significant. Not because I was anticipating this moment specifically, but because I am the kind of person who keeps records. There were emails from Edmund Hargrove personally thanking me for client retention after a difficult market period. Emails where he told me directly that a specific client had called him to say they trusted me more than anyone else they had worked with in the industry. Emails where I was explicitly credited for strategy decisions that later showed up in the firm's public reporting as team accomplishments. Every one of those emails went into the exhibit file. The third thing I did was request my personnel file from HR. Under applicable employment law, I was entitled to it, and the firm was required to provide it. It arrived in a sealed envelope 10 days after my request. I opened it at Diana's office with her beside me. 2 things stood out immediately. The first was the official reason for my termination. Role elimination due to organizational restructuring. Not performance, not misconduct, not cause of any kind. Role elimination, which meant the firm had framed this as a business decision, not a performance issue, and that framing had legal implications they apparently hadn't fully considered. The second was that the termination had been processed without any executed severance agreement. I had signed nothing, no release of claims, no waiver of any rights, nothing. They had moved so fast, and with such apparent confidence that I would simply leave without complications, that they had left me completely legally clean. Diana reviewed everything and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the exhibit file was, in her words, unusually tight. I took that as confirmation. The fourth thing I did was build a precise timeline, every date, the date of the firing, the date Natalie took the seat, the date the required 60-day notice should have been sent to each client, the date by which regulatory filings should have been updated, the date each of those deadlines passed without action. I put it all in a single document, clean and chronological. I was not a threat yet. From the outside, I looked like someone who had accepted what happened and moved on. I had not contacted the firm. I had not spoken to any clients. I had not made a single public statement. I had gone quiet. But on day 30, Diana called the timeline document the clearest piece of evidence I have seen in a licensing dispute case. She asked me when I wanted to move. I told her I wasn't ready yet. I told her I was still searching. That same week, a LinkedIn notification appeared on my phone. A message from Natalie Crane. The tone was professional, slightly formal, and carried just a trace of something that felt like condescension dressed as courtesy. She said she hoped I was doing well. She said she was reaching out because she wanted to ensure a smooth knowledge transfer for the portfolio relationships. She asked if I might be available for a call. I read it twice. I did not respond. The silence felt like the most powerful thing I had done in 30 days. 6 weeks after they walked me out of the building, Spencer Hargrove posted on LinkedIn. I wouldn't have seen it myself. I had stepped back from checking the firm's activity deliberately, but a former colleague forwarded it to me with no comment, just the screenshot. The post announced that Hargrove Capital Partners had completed a strategic realignment of senior portfolio leadership and was excited to introduce dynamic new direction for its institutional client relationships. He didn't name Natalie directly, but he tagged the firm and used language clearly designed to signal a fresh chapter. The kind of language that sounds impressive until you know what it's covering up. I read it once and set my phone face down on the kitchen table. The post was confident, celebratory, even. Spencer was positioning this as a success, a bold leadership decision, a firm moving forward. And from the outside, if you didn't know anything about licensing structures or consent clauses or regulatory filing requirements, it might have looked exactly like that. But I knew something the post didn't mention. He was now 43 days past my termination date. The required client consent notices had never been sent. The regulatory filings had never been updated. Every single management action taken on those 3 accounts since the day Natalie sat down in my chair had been executed under a license that still had my name on it. Spencer was announcing wins that weren't his, over accounts he didn't legally control, under a license he had never bothered to transfer. Around the same time, I received word through my contact still inside the firm that 2 of my long-term clients had already attempted routine check-in calls with Natalie. The family office and the university endowment, both of whom had quarterly touchpoints built into their communication cadence, had each reached out once. Neither call had gone well. Natalie hadn't been familiar with the specific mandate structures of either account. She hadn't known the risk parameters I had negotiated directly with each client over years of conversation. She hadn't known the informal communication rhythms, which clients preferred written summaries before calls, which preferred to talk through numbers verbally, which committee members had specific sensitivities that needed to be managed carefully. That kind of knowledge isn't in a file. It lives in the relationship, and the relationship was with me. Harold Fenwick had not called Natalie at all. What Harold had done instead was send a single brief email to the firm's general portfolio inbox. It was polite and short. He asked, when he could connect with the usual team, regarding some questions he had ahead of the board's next quarterly meeting. The response he received was a templated reply from Natalie's assistant, acknowledging the inquiry and noting that someone would be in touch. Harold did not follow up with the firm after that. What he did instead was text my personal number on a Saturday morning. I was making coffee when my phone lit up on the counter. The message was 4 words, "Are you still with them?" I looked at it for a moment. Then I typed 3 words back. "No, I left. I kept it clean. I didn't explain. I didn't offer details." I didn't say anything that could be read as an attempt to influence a client relationship. Harold's reply came within 2 minutes. "I'd like to catch up." I told him I'd be in touch soon. I set the phone down and finished making my coffee. That text message was the first visible crack in the surface. Harold Fenwick had been managing public pension money for over 20 years. He understood fiduciary responsibility the way some people understand their own handwriting. Instinctively, completely. He did not text former advisors on Saturday mornings out of sentiment. He texted them because something felt wrong, and he wanted to understand what it was before it became a problem. He already sensed that something had shifted. He just didn't know the full shape of it yet. Meanwhile, an internal memo from Spencer, obtained through my colleague inside the firm, declared that the portfolio team had been stabilized and repositioned for growth. The word stabilized caught my attention. You only use that word when something was unstable. Spencer had written a memo describing a situation he had created as something he had resolved. He was managing a narrative for an internal audience that didn't know the compliance clock running beneath it. 43 days, no filings, no notices, no consent. The ground under Spencer's feet was hollow. He just hadn't looked down yet. On day 47, I called Diana and told her I was ready. She had the filing prepared. We had reviewed it twice the week before, and I had read every line myself until I was certain it said exactly what it needed to say and nothing more. It was clean, procedurally correct, and entirely within my rights as the named license holder. The filing stated that I, Serena Caldwell, as the licensed investment strategist of record on the Master Sub-Advisory License, registered with the State Regulatory Authority, was formally revoking the operating authorization granted to Hargrove Capital Partners to act under that license. The revocation was effective immediately, pending formal license reassignment proceeding in accordance with the applicable regulatory framework. Diana submitted it on a Wednesday morning. There was no press release, phone call to the firm, no warning. I did not contact Spencer. I did not contact anyone at Hargrove Capital Partners. I simply exercised a legal right that had been mine the entire time, through the proper channel in the proper format with proper documentation attached. The regulatory authority processed the filing and triggered automatic notifications to the 3 institutional clients named in the license. That was not my action. That was the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Harold Fenwick received the regulatory notification on Thursday morning. He called my personal number at 8:47 a.m. I picked up on the second ring. He didn't open with pleasantries. Harold rarely did. He said he had received a formal notice from the regulatory authority regarding the sub-advisory license on the pension board's account, and he wanted to understand what it meant. I told him calmly that I was no longer with Hargrove Capital Partners, that the license governing the board's account was registered in my name, and that because the proper transition process had not been followed after my departure, I had filed a revocation as the license holder. I told him that during the review period, no active management actions should proceed on the account without the board's explicit consent and proper regulatory clearance. I told him he should loop in the board's own legal counsel before taking any further steps. I kept my voice even the entire time. I did not use language that sounded like grievance. I did not mention Spencer by name. I stated facts. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he told me the board would be convening an emergency investment committee meeting the following Tuesday. He asked if I would be willing to present my position to the committee in person. I said yes. By Thursday afternoon, the University Endowment's legal counsel had sent a formal written inquiry to Hargrove Capital Partners. The letter requested full documentation of the licensing transition process and a copy of the 60-day consent notice that should have been provided to the endowment prior to any change in the licensing strategist of record. The tone of the letter was measured. Its legal implication was not. The family office sent a similar letter Friday morning. Their attorney's language was less measured. Spencer received all 3 communications inside a 48-hour window. My contact inside the firm told me what happened next. On Friday afternoon, Spencer called an emergency internal meeting. The compliance officer was in the room. The firm's outside counsel was on the phone. Spencer had reportedly raised his voice, something I was told he rarely did, and at one point told the compliance officer directly to find a fix before Tuesday. The compliance officer, from what I was told, had gone very quiet. There was no fix. There had never been a fix available. The moment Spencer skipped the licensing process and put Natalie in that chair without following the proper steps, he had locked himself into a position that got worse the longer he waited to address it. Every day that passed without the correct filings was another day of unauthorized account management. 47 of those days had already passed. Tuesday was 4 days away. I pressed my suit on Sunday evening and went to bed early. I arrived at the Municipal Pension Board's offices at 8:15 in the morning. The building was the kind of place that felt serious before you even walked through the door. Marble floors, frosted glass conference rooms, the particular quiet of an institution that manages other people's money and takes that responsibility literally. I had been in this building more times than I could count. I knew where the coffee was. I knew which elevator was slower. I knew the name of the woman at the front desk, and she smiled when she saw me and said it was good to see me again. Diana was beside me. She was carrying a structured document folder. Inside, it were 9 printed exhibit packages, one for each of the 7 investment committee members, one for the committee chair, and one spare. Each package contained the same materials in the same order: the original master license filing, the relevant consent clauses from the 3 client agreements, the chronological timeline of events from my termination date forward, and a 1-page summary of the regulatory framework governing sub-advisory license transitions. We had prepared those packages together over the previous week. Every page was clean. Every tab was labeled. Everything was in plain, readable language because I had insisted on it. I did not want anyone in that room to need a law degree to understand what had happened. Spencer arrived 12 minutes after I did. He came with the firm's outside counsel, a partner from a firm I recognized, and Natalie, who was dressed in a dark blazer and sat down in a chair along the side wall, without being directed to do so. She had the posture of someone who already knew this meeting was not going to go the way she had been told it would. She did not look at me when she sat down. She did not look at me for the rest of the meeting. Spencer looked at me once, briefly, when he entered the room. I met his eyes and said nothing. He looked away first. The committee chair called the meeting to order. He was a former city comptroller in his late 60s, and he had the particular manner of someone who had spent decades cutting through noise to find the number that actually mattered. He thanked both parties for attending and stated clearly that the committee's purpose was to understand the facts of the licensing situation so that it could fulfill its fiduciary obligations to the pension fund's beneficiaries. He asked for a factual account of the licensing timeline. Diana presented the exhibit packages. She walked through each element in sequence: the original license registration, the consent clause language in the client agreement, the date of my termination, the date Natalie assumed the portfolio director role, the specific regulatory filing requirements that applied to a change in the named license holder, and the absence of any filing notice or client acknowledgement between my termination date and the revocation I had filed on day 47. She placed a single number in the center of the table, 47. 47 days of portfolio management activity conducted under a license that had not been properly transitioned. 47 days of decisions made on behalf of $18 million of pension fund assets, by a firm operating without the authorization their own client agreement required. The room was very quiet while she spoke. The firm's outside counsel attempted a response. He argued that the master license had been functionally superseded by my termination, that as an employee, my designation as license holder was contingent on my employment, and that when the employment ended, the license authority transferred to the firm automatically. Diana had anticipated this argument. She responded without hesitation, reading directly from the applicable regulatory language. License designations of this type survive employment termination and require an independent, separately filed transition process to be legally reassigned. The license does not follow the employment. The employment and the license are two distinct instruments under two distinct regulatory frameworks. The transition of the license requires its own process, its own filings, its own notifications, and, where embedded in client agreements, its own client consent. The firm's counsel had no counter. He looked down at the table briefly and said nothing further on that point. One of the committee members, a retired CFO who had served on the board for 6 years, leaned forward in his chair and looked directly at the firm's outside counsel. He asked a single question: "Did you send the 60-day notice to this board?" The counsel said no. The CFO looked at him for a moment. Then he said quietly and clearly, "Then you were managing our money without authorization for 47 days. That sentence landed in the room like a door closing. Spencer's hands were flat on the table in front of him. He said nothing. He had not spoken since the meeting began. He looked like a man who had arrived prepared to negotiate and had discovered within the first 20 minutes that there was nothing left to negotiate about. The committee chair asked me directly what outcome I was seeking from the meeting. I had prepared my answer carefully. I told the committee that I was not there to seek any personal remedy through this forum. I was there because I had a legal obligation as the former license holder to ensure that the board had accurate, complete information about the compliance status of their account, so that the committee could make fully informed decisions in the interest of the fund's beneficiaries. Whatever the committee chose to do with that information was entirely within their authority. That was true, and it was also, strategically, exactly the right thing to say, because it made clear that I was not the aggressor. I was the person providing the facts. The committee was drawing its own conclusions. The committee moved to immediately suspend all active account management on the pension fund's portfolio pending formal resolution of the licensing review. The board's attorney would be sending a formal demand letter to Hargrove Capital partners within 24 hours. The $18 million account was frozen. The meeting ended. People gathered their papers. Spencer stood slowly. In the lobby, as Diana and I were putting on our coats, I heard his footsteps behind me. He stopped a few feet away and waited until Diana stepped to the side to take a call. His voice was low and tight. He said I hadn't needed to do this. He said there could have been another way to handle it. He asked me what I wanted. I looked at him evenly. I told him my attorney would send a formal list of terms within the week. Then I turned and walked to the car. My hands were completely steady. The 10 days after the pension board meeting were very busy for Hargrove Capital Partners. The university's endowment placed a formal 30-day activity hold on its account. Their investment committee sent written notice to the firm stating that no portfolio actions would be authorized until the licensing situation was fully resolved and documented to the committee's satisfaction. The family office's attorney sent a letter demanding a complete audit of all account management activity since my departure, every trade, every reallocation, every communication made under the disputed license. The family's principal, a man in his 70s who had trusted me with his family's money for 7 years, called the firm and asked to speak directly with Edmund Hargrove, apparently unaware of how far Edmund's health had declined. He was redirected to Spencer. He did not find that satisfactory. The firm's outside counsel sent Spencer a formal written memo advising that continued inaction in the face of 3 simultaneous client inquiries and an active regulatory licensing dispute created material liability, both civil and regulatory. The memo used the word significant 3 times in 2 pages. On day 8 after the board meeting, Diana sent Spencer's legal team the terms letter. There were 4 items. The first was a full severance settlement. The calculation was based on my original contract terms: the base, the performance structure, the benefits, plus a separate premium tied specifically to the disruption of the sub-advisory licensing framework and the unauthorized management activity that had occurred under my license after my termination. Diana had been methodical about the math. and the number reflected that. The second item was a formal letter of reference, issued on firm letterhead, attesting to my 11 years of service, my contribution to the firm's institutional portfolio growth, and the fact that my departure had been a voluntary separation under a firm restructuring, not a performance-related termination. The letter was to be signed by a member of the firm's board of directors, not by Spencer. The third item was a clean licensing transfer agreement, properly drafted and executed, filed correctly with the regulatory authority, formally reassigning the master license to a designated representative at Hargrove Capital Partners. The transfer was to be accompanied by written notification to each of the 3 clients in compliance with the 60-day consent process, even retroactively structured where possible, so that the firm could resume lawful management of the accounts. This item was included not as a favor to Spencer. It was included because I understood that 3 institutional clients with frozen accounts were not well served by a licensing dispute that dragged on indefinitely, and because it was the procedurally correct resolution. I was not interested in keeping the firm in violation. I was interested in being made whole. The fourth item was a mutual non-disparagement agreement. Both directions. I would not speak publicly about Spencer Natalie or the specifics of the licensing dispute. The firm would not speak publicly or privately about me in any negative context. Spencer agreed to all 4 terms within 6 days. He did not attempt to negotiate the settlement figure. His outside counsel had apparently told him plainly that he had no position from which to negotiate, that the facts of the unauthorized management activity, combined with the 3 simultaneous client actions and the active regulatory matter, left the firm exposed on multiple fronts simultaneously. Fighting the terms would only extend the exposure. The math was clear. The letter of reference was signed by Margaret Ossie, the firm's independent board chair, not by Spencer. When Diana told me who had signed it, I read the name twice and allowed myself a small private moment of satisfaction. The settlement amount is not something I will disclose. What I will say is that it was enough to fund the next chapter of my career, without pressure, without urgency, and without needing anything from anyone quickly. I spent the following week setting up my own registered investment advisory firm. Small, independent, built entirely on my own registration and my own compliance structure. A team of 2, plus me. No reliance on anyone else's license. No master structure with someone else's name at the top. Just my own work, under my own authority, subject to my own decisions. 91 days after the settlement closed, Harold Fenwick called me on a Thursday afternoon. He told me the pension board's investment committee had voted to move the account. They were transferring the $18 million portfolio to my new firm. Harold said the committee had discussed it and concluded that the relationship had always been with me, not with the Hargrove name. I thanked him. I kept my voice professional. 2 weeks after that, the university in Doutzen sent a formal letter of inquiry to my new firm expressing interest in an advisory engagement. 3 weeks after that, the family office called. By the end of that year, I was sitting at my own desk, in my own office, managing just over $40 million. The same relationships, the same clients, the same work I had always done, except that now every structure, every filing, every license, and every agreement had my name on it in the right way for the right reasons. I think about Spencer occasionally, not often. I don't know exactly what happened to him internally after everything settled. I know the firm lost its 3 largest institutional accounts. I know the management fee revenue dropped significantly. I know that a 31-year-old who fires the person holding the master license to give the seat to his girlfriend and then throws a celebration, dinner 2 days later is probably not the kind of operator who learns quietly from a mistake like that. But that is not my concern anymore. The last thing Spencer ever said to me directly was in that lobby, in a low voice with tight edges. "You didn't have to do this." He was right, in a narrow sense. I didn't have to do any of it. I didn't have to build those client relationships for 11 years. I didn't have to document everything carefully. I didn't have to keep a copy of the contract addendum in a private folder on my phone. I didn't have to hire the right attorney or build a clean exhibit file or show up to a pension board meeting in a navy suit with 9 printed packages and every fact in order. I didn't have to do any of it, but I had spent 11 years making sure I could.